The slap cracked across Nolan Pierce's face in the middle of the Blackthorn Imperial Hotel's grand lobby, delivered without warning by Grant Whitmore in front of cameras, investors, and the woman who used to wear Nolan's ring. Grant straightened his cuffs, turned to the head of security, and ordered the man he had just called a failure to be thrown off the premises and banned from returning. No one standing in that marble atrium knew that Nolan had quietly purchased 61% controlling ownership of the entire hotel chain only 3 days before. When the security team advanced, Sebastian Blackthorn himself came rushing down the private staircase, stopped cold in front of Nolan, and said in a low, deliberate voice, "Boss, how would you like this handled?" Grant's confident smile disappeared in an instant, but that was only the beginning. If you want to see the arrogant fall and the man they underestimated walk out through every door, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. It had been raining for 2 hours by the time the Blackthorn Imperial Manhattan dressed itself for the evening, its chandeliers burning full against the dark windows, while event staff arranged champagne towers across the main floor. The occasion was the public announcement of a renovation partnership between the hotel chain and Whitmore Development Group, a contract worth $180 million. The kind of number that made investors fly in from 3 time zones away. Grant Whitmore arrived in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, Tessa on his arm in a gown the color of deep water, the two of them moving through the lobby like people who had rehearsed being watched. Tessa said little during the drive over, her eyes moving occasionally toward the lobby doors, her jaw set with the tension of someone trying not to think about the last time she had stood in this building, when the vows she was exchanging with a different man were still warm in her mouth. Nolan Pierce arrived on foot, carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing a dark jacket soft at the elbows from too many washings. He took the main entrance, did not announce himself, and did not pause to look at the event banners or the crowd assembling near the champagne stations. He had the unhurried manner of someone who had already accounted for every variable in the room, and he walked toward the front desk with the same measured pace he used anywhere he needed to go. The associate on duty looked up and concluded in approximately 4 seconds that the man in the worn jacket was either lost or applying for a position in the facilities department. Nolan answered that he had a private appointment with Sebastian Blackthorn at 7:30, which was true, though the appointment had been entered under a code name known to fewer than 4 people in the building, and his name did not appear anywhere on the evening's guest list, which was also by design. Reed Barlow, the hotel's general manager, materialized within moments, having spent the past hour circling the lobby with the alertness of someone whose bonus was tied directly to the flawlessness of this particular evening. He was 52 years old and had built his career on knowing which guests to elevate and which to redirect before they became inconvenient, and the man in the worn jacket registered immediately as the latter. He instructed Nolan to wait near the side corridor until the evening's principal events had concluded, and Nolan did not protest, did not show identification, and did not explain himself, which Reed took as confirmation of his assessment. What Reed did not know was that Nolan had been cataloging every small act of deference and condescension since he walked through the door, who received eye contact, who received a chin raise, and who received nothing at all. A bellman named Daniel, 23 years old and 3 months into his first full-time job, was crossing the lobby with a stack of event folders at the precise moment Grant Whitmore turned away from a cluster of investors with more momentum than awareness. The folders hit the floor in a burst of scattered pages, and Grant's reaction came before Daniel could process what had happened. A sharp public reprimand loud enough that 3 nearby guests turned toward the sound. Daniel crouched and began gathering the pages with trembling hands, and it was Nolan, standing near the side corridor where Reed had parked him, who walked over and began stacking the pages back in order. The gesture lasted no more than 90 seconds and attracted almost no attention, which was exactly how Nolan preferred to move through the world. Grant noticed the crouching figure when one of his investors made a brief remark about it, and that was when he looked up and recognized the face beneath the worn jacket. Grant's posture shifted in the way that postures shift when history enters a room uninvited. He covered the distance between them in a dozen strides, stopped 2 feet from Nolan, and stood there with the satisfaction of a man who had decided the best response to a ghost was to remind it that it was dead. The years since the divorce had treated Grant well in terms of appearances. The tailored suit, the precision haircut, the practiced ease of someone who had long ago stopped needing to perform wealth because it had calcified into who he was. He looked at Nolan's jacket, then at Nolan's face, and then he smiled with the particular warmth of someone who does not mean it at all. "Are you here looking for work?" Grant said, loudly enough to carry, "or did you come to ask my wife to feel sorry for you?" Nolan did not react to the question in any visible way, which was the most destabilizing response possible, because Grant had been expecting anger, and what he received instead was calm attention, as if Nolan were simply waiting for the sentence to finish. He said, evenly, that he had a private meeting with Sebastian Blackthorne scheduled for the end of the hour, and that the matter was unrelated to the evening's celebration. Grant laughed, a sound constructed for the benefit of the investors and journalists nearby, and said a man in a thrift store jacket had no private meeting with anyone who mattered. Reed Barlow appeared within moments and consulted the registration list with theatrical thoroughness, before confirming that Nolan Pierce did not appear anywhere on the authorized guest manifest. Tessa had gone still near the champagne stations, her glass held at an angle she no longer noticed, watching from the distance of someone, hoping the floor would arrange an interruption. Grant read her stillness as something else entirely, and it made him worse. He turned back to Nolan and began, at moderate volume, to recount events from a chapter of their shared history that Nolan had never invited anyone to revisit. The years when the startup had burned through its runway, the months in a rented apartment with second-hand furniture, the family vacation that never happened, the job offers Nolan had allegedly turned down because he preferred a project that went nowhere over a salary that would have kept his family comfortable. Nolan listened without interrupting because he had heard versions of this accounting before and knew the version being told tonight was incomplete in ways that were not accidental. When Grant paused for effect, Nolan said quietly that he would appreciate it if Grant stopped using that tone with Daniel. The unexpected pivot silenced Grant for exactly 3 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than most people could hold silence under Grant's attention. Grant turned toward Daniel, who had finished gathering the folders and was attempting to make himself architecturally small near the corridor wall, then turned back to Nolan with the expression of a man who has decided that the conversation has gone on long enough. He said the hotel was about to become his organization's primary project site, which meant every person in the building would answer to his contractors before the end of the week, and whatever Nolan thought he was doing by showing up uninvited, the outcome would be the same as it had always been. Nolan replied, without particular emphasis, that a person who had not yet read the final terms of a contract was in no position to describe what the contract made possible. It was a short sentence, said calmly, but it landed in the vicinity of the investors like a door swinging open on a room they had not known existed, and Grant felt it. He closed the distance between them and closed his hand around the lapel of Nolan's jacket. Nolan reached up and disengaged the grip without escalating it, his hands returning to his sides in the same moment, leaving Grant with nothing to push against and no audience reaction to feed on. What happened next happened quickly. Grant's right hand swung across the intervening space and connected with the left side of Nolan's face, an open-palmed strike that produced a sound like a book dropped on marble. The lobby did not go quiet so much as it contracted, everyone in the room pulling toward the sound, and for 3 or 4 seconds the only movement was Grant smoothing the front of his jacket and Nolan standing exactly where he had been standing before, the mark already beginning to show on his cheekbone. Tessa made a sound that was not quite a word and did not move from where she was standing, and Grant used that stillness as permission, turning to Reed Barlow and instructing him to have Nolan removed from the premises immediately and permanently barred from re-entry. Reed issued the instruction without hesitation, and 2 security staff moved toward Nolan from opposite sides of the lobby. Nolan did not back away or raise his hands. He asked Reed, with the same measured attention he had applied to everything since walking through the door, whether he was certain he wanted to proceed with that order. Reed said Nolan did not have any standing in this building to ask questions, and that the answer was yes. The private elevator on the east wall opened then, not the service lift and not the public banks, but the one requiring a key card, issued only to building principals, and the sound of the doors parting cut through the lobby with the authority of something timed to arrive exactly when it did. Sebastian Blackthorne stepped out first, followed by Evelyn Ashford and 3 board members. Sebastian was 59 years old, the kind of man whose entrance into a room shifts its atmosphere, but what shifted it now was not his presence so much as his expression, an unmistakable alarm that had no place on the face of a host welcoming investors to a successful signing. He crossed the lobby floor at a pace that was not running, but contained its urgency in every step, stopped in front of Nolan, looked at the mark on his face, at the briefcase on the floor, and at the 2 guards still positioned on either side. Then he inclined his head toward Nolan Pierce in a small, deliberate bow and said, "Boss, I'm very sorry. What would you like to do?" The silence that followed had a different quality from the one that had followed the slap. That one had been shocked. This one was trying to rearrange itself around new information. Grant's laugh arrived before his words did, a short percussive sound meant to convey that the room had witnessed a clerical error rather than anything that altered the fundamental order of things. He suggested Sebastian appeared to have confused Nolan with someone actually scheduled to be there, and that the matter would be resolved momentarily. Sebastian looked at Grant with the patience of a man who has already decided how a conversation ends and is waiting for the other person to arrive there. And then he said what he intended everyone in the room to hear. Nolan Pierce was the majority owner of the Blackthorn Imperial Hotel Group, holding 61% of the controlling equity effective as of 3 days ago, and his authority over every contract, personnel decision, and financial commitment made under the hotel's name was total and unconditional. The mark on Nolan's face, Sebastian added, had been placed there by a man who had just physically assaulted the chairman of the board in his own building, in front of witnesses and cameras and the investors whose confidence in this organization was the entire purpose of tonight's gathering. The room processed this information at different speeds, depending on how much standing each person had to lose. Reed Barlow processed it fastest, and what crossed his face was the particular color of someone watching a career retract like a tide going out all at once. The investors near the champagne tables lowered their glasses with the self-conscious care of people trying to look as though they had not been laughing 10 seconds ago. Grant stood in the center of the developing silence and ran through his options in a way that was visible on his face. And Tessa watched him do it from across the lobby and felt for the first time in several years the discomfort of knowing something about someone that you had been choosing not to know. Nolan had not moved from where he was standing. He picked up the briefcase from the floor, dusted the clasp, and waited while the room resettled. Grant changed his tone with the efficiency of a man who had practiced pivoting under pressure, describing the evening's incident as a private family misunderstanding that looked worse from the outside than it was, the kind of thing two reasonable parties could resolve without making it a matter of public record. He extended his hand toward Nolan, and it hung in the air for a moment before Nolan spoke. He told Evelyn, standing 4 feet to his left with a legal pad already open, that he needed 4 things to happen immediately. The security camera archive was to be isolated and sealed under chain of custody. Written statements were to be collected from all staff who had witnessed the evening's events. Reed Barlow's instruction history for the evening was to be documented, and the signing ceremony for the Whitmore development contract was to be formally postponed pending review. Grant's hand came down. His objection arrived with volume and the performed indignation of a man whose options were narrowing in real time, and he said what he said next with the confidence of someone who believed that naming something as retaliation made it retaliation. That Nolan was using a corporate position to settle a personal score, that the contract postponement was an abuse of ownership privilege disguised as due diligence, and that everyone in the room could see what was actually happening. Nolan said that the contract had been flagged before this evening because 3 separate budget submissions from Whitmore Development contained line items that did not reconcile with one another by a combined margin of several $1,000,000, and that the physical incident in the lobby had not created the problem. It had only clarified the character of the person asking him to approve it. He said the slap told him exactly how Grant Whitmore responded when his authority was questioned, which was useful information for anyone entering a $180 million partnership with him. Sebastian asked Reed to surrender his management access card and step back from duty pending a review, speaking in the same tone he might use to ask someone to hold the elevator, and Reed complied without protest because the other options available to him had just collapsed. Nolan did not issue a termination because an immediate termination would tell him nothing about whether Reed's behavior was the product of personal habit or financial arrangement, and that distinction mattered for what came next. When Grant reached for Tessa's arm to guide her toward the exit, Nolan said, in a voice that was not raised but carried through the room with the ease of something that did not need volume, that Tessa Whitmore would need to remain available to Evelyn's team that evening. There were financial documents in Whitmore Development's recent filings that bore her name, and the amounts attached to those signatures were not small. Tessa looked at Grant. Grant looked away. Evelyn opened the briefcase Nolan held out to her and removed a bound document from the top of the stack inside. The document was not a job application or a delivery receipt. It was a forensic audit. The cover page read, in standard font without drama, Whitmore Development Group, Material Risk of Financial Irregularity. 7 years is long enough for a person to build an entire architecture of explanation around a decision they have not fully examined, and Tessa Whitmore had constructed hers with care. The marriage to Nolan had failed because he had been unwilling to choose family over ambition, because he had poured their savings into a project that never materialized into anything a bank would fund, because he had declined a senior consulting position that would have given them stability, and because he had ultimately placed his vision above the people who depended on him. These were the reasons she had repeated to herself in the months after the divorce was finalized, and they had the coherence that reasons acquire when they go unchallenged long enough. What Tessa had not known was that the consulting position Nolan had supposedly turned down had never actually been offered to him. The offer had been quietly intercepted, and the responding email altered before it reached his inbox, by a man who was, at the time, positioning himself as a supportive friend of the family. Nolan had been building something the industry did not yet have a category for, a predictive analytics platform that could assess operational inefficiency in large hotel portfolios, project points of revenue failure before they became irreversible, and give chain operators a diagnostic tool that made the difference between a managed contraction and a full collapse. The work required time, the marriage required him not to spend on it, and he understood that contradiction clearly, which was why he had tried to explain it to Tessa more than once using language she did not yet have the context to evaluate. Grant Whitmore had appeared during this period as a familiar figure, a client contact who had become a fixture at dinner parties, and his interest in Nolan's platform had not been the casual curiosity he performed in front of others. He had made a private offer to acquire the algorithm at a fraction of its development cost, and when Nolan declined, Grant had pursued a different approach. He had systematically dismantled the conditions that made the work possible. The investment deal Nolan had been close to closing fell apart in a single phone call between Grant and the lead investor. A conversation in which Grant shared concerns about the founder's reliability that were presented as confidential disclosures between colleagues and accepted as such. The emails Grant sent to Tessa over the following weeks were crafted with the patience of someone who understood that belief is changed not by argument, but by accumulated evidence. Nolan had been moving family money into the project without consultation. He had rejected the stable position rather than supporting his household. He cared more about being right than about being present. Each piece arrived formatted as concern from a friend rather than a campaign, which is the format most difficult to identify as false. Nolan had known something was being orchestrated, and he had no proof he could present to Tessa in a way that would not simply look like a husband trying to discredit the one person listening to his wife. And so he had made the decision that would stay with him for 7 years. He had stayed quiet. The divorce was finalized in the ordinary way that divorces are when neither party contests the essential facts, only their interpretation. Nolan asked for one thing: the majority of the physical custody arrangement for Paige, and he received it without conflict because Grant had already assessed the teenager as an inconvenience rather than an asset to the next phase of Tessa's life. The algorithm was sold 18 months after the divorce to an international hospitality investment consortium for a sum that positioned Nolan as someone who no longer needed to seek investment from anyone. He moved through the years between that sale and the current evening without public profile or press releases, which was not modesty so much as preference. He found that the quieter he kept his circumstances, the cleaner his assessments remained. In the hotel's private conference room, Tessa asked Nolan the question she had been carrying since the lobby: why he had never told her. He said that asking someone to conclude that a trusted friend manipulated them is asking them to dismantle a significant portion of their recent past, and he had not wanted to deploy that as a mechanism for winning an argument about who was right. He said the marriage had been in trouble before Grant introduced himself into it, and that he had not always been as present as the work demanded he not be, and he was not interested in a version of the story in which he was entirely blameless. The thing he was not willing to do, he said, was pretend that the silence she had maintained while he stood there with her husband's handprint on his face had not happened, because it had, and because it was her silence to account for, not his to explain away. Grant, who had positioned himself at the far end of the conference table in the posture of someone awaiting an opportunity to redirect the proceedings, said that any financial irregularities in the Whitmore development filings would be explained fully by the documentation he intended to provide, and that Nolan's ownership of the hotel gave him no legitimate authority to impound records from a private company. Evelyn informed him that 2 of the financial filings in question had been submitted to Blackthorne Imperial's own board as part of the contract approval process, which made them subject to the hotel's legal review authority regardless of where they originated. She placed a single sheet of paper on the table and said, without elaboration, that a transfer of approximately $3 million from the renovation budget allocation to a limited liability company registered to a former administrative employee of Whitmore Development had been identified in the preliminary audit, and that the transfer had occurred 4 months before the contract was officially signed. The audit told the story the way audits always do, not with drama but with arithmetic. Each line of figures a stone dropped into still water. Nolan and Evelyn worked through the Whitmore Development file in the private conference room, while the lobby outside slowly emptied of its champagne towers and its optimistic guest list. And what the arithmetic said was this: Grant Whitmore's company was carrying a debt load of over $110 million against a portfolio of assets that existed largely as projections and intentions, and the $180 million Blackthorn contract was not a business opportunity but a pressure valve, the thing standing between Whitmore Development and a bank call that would reclassify its outstanding loans as non-performing and initiate procedures that could not be quietly managed. Grant had committed to that contract before it had been approved, using its anticipated value to extend his credit lines with 2 separate institutional lenders who believed the partnership was further along than it was, and the presentation materials his team had shared with Blackthorn's board contained cost estimates that did not match the subcontractor quotes on file by margins too consistent to be error. There was also the matter of the invoices Reed Barlow had authenticated over the past 10 months. 6 separate billings for preliminary assessment work and site preparation had been processed and paid from the renovation reserve account, and the vendors named on those invoices did not have verifiable operational histories at the addresses they listed. 3 of them shared a registered agent with the limited liability company that had received the $3 million transfer, and 2 had been approved in writing by Reed despite not appearing on the hotel's approved contractor list. Evelyn laid each invoice beside its corresponding wire transfer receipt and said nothing, because the document said everything, and she had learned that silence applied correctly carries more weight than summary. Tessa had been sitting at the end of the table with the expression of someone watching a magic trick being disassembled from the inside, each reveal removing wonder rather than producing it. And what was left when the wonder was gone was the shape of something she recognized. She said she had signed a financial guarantee document 14 months ago inside a packet of routine corporate paperwork Grant had asked her to initial on an ordinary Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table, and that she had not understood the document she was signing to be a personal guarantee on a $42 million credit facility. Grant said the terms had been disclosed and she was sophisticated enough to read what she signed. Tessa asked why, if the terms had been disclosed, the specific page containing the guarantee language had been inserted between 2 boilerplate addenda in a packet of over 60 pages, with no tab, no bold header, and no summary sheet identifying it as a material commitment. Grant did not answer. Nolan said a system that functions correctly only when no one examines it closely is not a functioning system. And the documents in front of them existed before tonight, had been flagged before tonight, and would have arrived at the same conclusions regardless of whether he had walked through that lobby door. He gave Grant 24 hours to produce the original ledgers, a full accounting of subcontractor relationships, the provenance of every wire transfer in the renovation budget, and a written explanation of the guarantee documents Tessa had signed. Grant said the request was reasonable and that he would need to involve his legal team, then left with the posture of a man who had decided this was a setback rather than an ending. And as soon as the hallway was clear, he placed a phone call to a Blackthorn board member who had, 6 weeks earlier, accepted a personal investment from a company Grant controlled. By the following morning, a television news segment carried a story attributed to an anonymous source close to the transaction. The story described a reclusive billionaire who had purchased a controlling stake in a luxury hotel chain for reasons that were, according to the source, explicitly personal. He was attempting to destabilize the business interests of his ex-wife's new husband using a corporate structure as cover. The segment ran a photograph of Nolan taken from a distance outside the hotel, jacket collar up, face turned slightly away from the lens, and above the photograph appeared a chyron reading in stark white letters, "Revenge or Business?" Frey. The video that circulated that morning had been edited with the competence of someone who understood which 17 seconds to remove. What remained showed Sebastian Blackthorne addressing Nolan Pierce as boss in front of a stunned lobby audience, followed by Nolan issuing instructions to freeze the contract, followed by the clearing of the event floor while Grant stood off to one side watching. What had been removed was the portion that preceded all of it. Grant's hand on Nolan's lapel, the arc of the arm, the sound on marble, the moment that explained everything that came after. Without those 17 seconds, the sequence read as a man with a grudge using institutional authority to shut down a business rival's evening, and Grant understood this perfectly because he had been the one to select the 17 seconds. He held the press conference at 10 in the morning in the lobby of the Whitmore development offices, standing at a lectern placed at a camera-friendly angle, with Tessa positioned to his left. He described his relationship with Nolan Pierce as a history of one-sided conflict, said the acquisition of the Blackthorne chain had been timed deliberately to coincide with his company's most significant pending contract, and that the investigation was not a compliance review but an act of targeted interference. Tessa stood beside him for the duration and said nothing, did not endorse his account and did not contradict it. And the cameras, having no third option, filed both her posture and her silence under the category of support. Several members of Blackthorne's senior board, who had not been present in the lobby and relied on the public record for their understanding of events, asked Evelyn whether the investigation could be paused or transferred to remove the appearance of a conflict of interest. Nolan accepted the suggestion before they finished making it. He said he had no objection to Evelyn conducting the investigation with full independence, that he would recuse himself from any decision-making connected to the Whitmore development matter, and that a third-party forensic accounting firm with no prior relationship to either party should be appointed to co-lead the review. The board members had been prepared for resistance and received agreement, which disarmed the argument before it could become what they had feared. Grant, hearing that Nolan had stepped back, told a financial journalist that the man simply did not have the substance to fight when the pressure was real, describing Nolan as a single father who got lucky with a piece of software and expressing confidence that the contract review would conclude in Whitmore Development's favor within the week. Paige Pierce saw the segment on a tablet that evening and brought it to Nolan at the kitchen counter. He put the tablet down and said that some people in business disagreed strongly and that the disagreement was being worked out through the right channels, and that he was not asking her to have any particular opinion about it, or about her mother, or about anyone else involved. Paige said that was a very diplomatic way of saying nothing. Nolan said he preferred diplomacy to the alternative. Evelyn's team, working through the footage metadata from the hotel's internal system, traced the edited video to an account registered to a communications contractor whose only verifiable client over the past 3 years was Whitmore Development Group. The original camera file, the complete footage including the 17 missing seconds, no longer existed on Blackthorne Imperial's primary server. The deletion log showed an access event at 2:14 in the morning executed through a terminal assigned to a management-level security account. The account had been assigned to Reed Barlow. Reed Barlow had not gone home after surrendering his access card. He had gone instead to a mid-range hotel near the Bridge District that accepted cash, bringing with him a portable hard drive holding 5 months of internal correspondence, scanned vendor documents, and administrator-level access logs he had downloaded over 3 sessions during the preceding week, operating on the theory that the best insurance against being made a scapegoat was to become the person who could explain everyone else. He was still weighing whether to bring it to investigators, to a journalist, or to Grant himself in exchange for something useful, when Nolan Pierce knocked on the door at 9:15 in the morning. Nolan had not arrived with security. He had arrived with Evelyn, which communicated something specific. This was a negotiation, and the other party was still making a decision rather than someone who had already made one. Nolan sat down across from Reed, placed the hard drive he already knew existed in the space between them, and explained what Grant's legal team had been doing since 6 that morning. Grant had submitted an affidavit to a financial regulator describing the renovation account irregularities as the product of a rogue hotel employee acting without authorization, and the affidavit named Reed Barlow as the individual responsible for approving the fraudulent vendor invoices. Nolan said he did not know whether that affidavit was accurate, but that Reed had approximately 12 hours before it was formalized and filed in a way that would make correction very difficult. Reed sat across from him for a long moment. Then he began to talk. What he described over the next 40 minutes was the architecture of a relationship constructed over 4 years through small accumulations, a gift at the holidays, a favorable vendor arrangement, an introduction to an investment advisor affiliated with a Grant-controlled entity, and then the more specific requests that came later. Once enough history had been built that declining felt like burning something valuable. He had approved the invoices because he had been told to, telling himself each one was too small to constitute a genuine risk, eventually stopping asking what they were for because asking questions required him to know the answers. The camera deletion had been instructed via a message received at 2 in the morning from an unrecognized number, but the message had arrived alongside a complete login credential for the system, meaning someone had prepared for this possibility before the evening began. Evelyn took down the account without commentary. She informed Reed that a cooperation agreement with the investigating authority would almost certainly result in reduced liability. Not immunity, but reduction, and that the value of that reduction depended entirely on the completeness and accuracy of what he provided. Reed passed the hard drive across the table. Nolan said nothing through this exchange and did not thank Reed when it was over, but he did tell him, standing at the door of the room, that the bellman whose folders he had scattered in the lobby had been formally reassigned to a department that did not require him to interact with guests who treated people as furniture. Reed said he hadn't thought about Daniel since the incident. Nolan said he knew. That afternoon, Tessa called from a number Nolan did not recognize and asked to meet somewhere that wasn't her home and wasn't anywhere Grant could characterize as a private exchange between former spouses settling old scores. They met at the office of a civil attorney, a conference room with recording equipment running and 2 witnesses present. Nolan's conditions, made not as punishment but as structural protection against future narrative revision. Tessa placed a folder on the table containing 3 documents. An email from Nolan to her from 7 years ago in its original form, and beside it the version she had actually received. Same date, same sender line, 3 paragraphs altered in ways that inverted their meaning. There was also a payment record reflecting a fee paid to a man whose name appeared nowhere in Nolan's company records, but who had been a contact of the lead investor who withdrew from Nolan's funding Around 12 days after the payment was made, she said she was sorry. Nolan said he believed her, and that the apology did not undo the choice she made to stay in silence while he stood in the lobby with her husband's handprint on his face. He was not asking her to do anything differently in hindsight, only to understand that he had watched her make that choice and remembered it. Tessa said she did not expect anything from him, only to testify. Then she told him that Grant had scheduled a wire transfer for that evening, moving what remained of Whitmore Development's liquid holdings into an international entity registered in a jurisdiction with limited disclosure requirements. Grant Whitmore had chosen to hold the gala at Blackthorn Imperial itself because the statement required a location equal to its ambition, and there was no statement quite like walking into the building where your authority had been questioned and demonstrating, through presence alone, that the questioning had resolved nothing. He had arranged for a representative from the new investment vehicle, a fund whose capital was substantially his own, cycled through 2 intermediate structures, to attend the signing, and he had told his remaining board contacts that the investigation had been based on a mischaracterization planted by a rival with personal motives. Nolan arrived an hour before the event, took the main entrance again, the same doors he had come through 3 nights before, and the staff member at the welcome desk greeted him with the unhurried courtesy that good training produces, not because she recognized him, but because she would have greeted anyone standing there the same way. He thanked her, stopped briefly near the coat check where Daniel was working, exchanged a few words, and continued toward the ballroom. Grant made a remark about recurring disruptions when Nolan entered the ballroom, and the guests nearest him offered the courtesy laughs that are the ambient tax of proximity to powerful people. Nolan said he was attending in his capacity as the controlling shareholder of a venue in which a fraudulent investment vehicle was being used to solicit commitments from individuals without full information, and Evelyn announced that an emergency session of the Blackthorn board had been convened in this room effective immediately. The original footage ran on the projection screen. All of it, including the 17 seconds the morning's edited version had removed, and the sound was better than anyone expected because the lobby system was professional grade and the slap had registered clearly. Reed Barlow's sworn statement described in sequence the invoice approvals, the payment structure, and the instruction to delete the camera archive. The $3 million transfer was traced to a source account that had received its funds from the renovation budget 6 weeks before a single hammer had been lifted, and the investment vehicle Grant had proposed was identified through its registered agent as a structure whose capital came from an asset trust Grant himself had established 4 years earlier. Grant denied each element as it was introduced, but the denials were becoming structurally inconsistent, each one requiring a previous denial to be modified, and the investors in the room began the quiet process of re-evaluating their positions with the practiced invisibility of people who have been in rooms like this before and know that the door is more useful than the argument. Tessa walked to the front of the room. She placed her folder on the podium and said she had something to offer that was not testimony for or against either party in the room's dispute, but documentation of something that had been done to both of them by one actor 7 years before, and she wanted the record to reflect it. She described the original email, what it actually said, and then the version she had received, and when she was finished, Grant told her she had humiliated herself for a man who had never deserved her, and his voice had the particular frequency of someone whose next move is not words. 3 people took a step toward him simultaneously. Sebastian Blackthorn said that the capital Grant was describing as his own had been built on a line of credit secured by a contract whose approval was conditional on the signature of the majority owner, and that the majority owner's signature line on every draft of that contract remained, to this moment, blank. Nolan opened the briefcase and held up the final page. The signature line was empty. It had always been empty. The formal refusal of the contract was not delivered as a speech. Nolan signed the document declining approval, dated it, and handed it to Evelyn without theatrics, which was the most devastating possible delivery because it suggested the decision had required no effort. The bank's representative called his supervisor from the corridor outside the ballroom, and the outcome of that conversation reached Grant's financial officer before Grant himself had processed what had happened, which meant that by the time Grant tried to access the operational account he had been drawing against to cover the gala's deposit, the facility had been suspended pending review of the contract's status. The investors who had not yet made their exit completed it. The room reorganized itself around the new reality with the brisk efficiency of rooms that have learned to detach from whichever party has just lost. Grant found Nolan near the east wall, away from the cameras. His manner changed in the way manner changes when the performance has no audience left to sustain it. He said Nolan had won, the framing of a man who could not yet relinquish the vocabulary of competition, and asked what, having won, Nolan still wanted. Nolan said the question contained a misunderstanding. He had not been trying to defeat Grant Whitmore, because defeating someone requires them to be an obstacle worth your full attention, and Grant had occupied roughly the same space as a recurring administrative error, noted, documented, and eventually addressed. He said what he had wanted was not victory but accuracy, the accurate version of the financial record, the accurate version of the 7-year-old story, the accurate version of what the lobby cameras had recorded. The truth was not a trophy. It was just what happened. The evidence Evelyn compiled was transferred to the Financial Oversight Authority and the District Attorney's Office the following morning. And the process that followed was not dramatic in the way that financial fraud proceedings rarely are. Motions, depositions, and legal negotiation in which Grant's attorneys argued for reduced charges in exchange for cooperation with a broader investigation. Grant lost the company, the penthouse, and the one thing he had spent his adult life protecting. The perception that his success was structural rather than circumstantial. Reed Barlow was dismissed with documentation that permitted him to cooperate with the investigation without absorbing all of its weight, because making Reed the single-named villain in a story with multiple authors would have been both inaccurate and convenient for the people who had done more deliberate damage. Sebastian continued as the hotel's operational face while the transition governance was formalized, with a board composition requiring independent approval of any contract above $5 million and a compliance function reporting to the ownership entity rather than to executive management. Nolan circulated a service standards memo, 3 pages covering employee conduct toward guests, none of it saying anything a professional hospitality operation should have needed to be told, which was precisely the point of saying it. A standard that exists only when powerful guests are watching is not a standard. It is a performance. Grant stood at the lobby entrance with 2 members of his legal team before being escorted out, and the staff member who opened the door for him was Daniel, working a shift he had requested, performing his job with the impersonal courtesy that is the dignity of doing a thing correctly, regardless of who is receiving it. Nolan watched from the corridor and said nothing, marking the moment with no gesture that would have made the departure about himself. "You won," Grant said one last time, stopping at the door. "What exactly did you want from all of this?" Nolan said he had never needed to win against Grant. He had only needed the truth to arrive. 6 months is long enough for a reckoning to become a renovation and the Blackthorn Imperial Manhattan emerged from its internal audit period with the clarity of an institution that has been forced to see itself without its own public relations materials. The lobby was the same marble and the same light, but something in the atmosphere of the staff had shifted in the way atmospheres shift when people have been told, in formal writing with binding consequences, that the categories by which they had been organizing the world were no longer valid. Guests in expensive suits received the same greeting as guests in rain-damp jackets. Requests to remove individuals from the property required a written reason filed with the duty manager within the hour. The standard was not inspirational. It was procedural, and Nolan had insisted on the procedural version because inspiration fades, but documentation persists. He had not renamed any part of the hotel, had not hung a portrait in the executive corridor, or placed a commemorative plaque at the site of the lobby incident. The new ownership was noted in the public record and was otherwise treated as what it was, a financial fact, not a narrative event. Sebastian continued to be the face most guests associated with the brand, which suited both of them. Tessa had moved into a smaller apartment, taken a position at a mid-sized design firm, and was navigating the legal aftermath of her financial entanglement with counsel, who had told her that the exposure was significant but manageable, which she had learned to interpret as painful but survivable. She and Nolan had arrived, across several months of conversation, conducted largely in the context of their daughter's schedule, at the functional civility of two people who have decided that Paige's ability to move between their households without carrying the weight of their history is worth whatever it costs them personally. Paige appeared at the hotel's staff development program launch in the role of an audience member there to support her father, who had agreed to deliver brief remarks on operational ethics and long-term institutional value. She had told him before the event that the jacket he was wearing was the same one from the night of the lobby incident and had become something of an artifact in the coverage. He said he knew and had worn it deliberately. She asked why. He said because the jacket had been in the room for all of it. The dismissal, the slap, the recognition, the investigation, and this, which made it the most honest thing in his wardrobe. Paige said that was the kind of thing a person said when they had thought about it too much. He said she was probably right. Nolan stopped at the front desk on his way out and asked Claire, the woman who had greeted him before the gala without knowing who he was, whether the evening had gone well. She said it had, then mentioned, with the slight pause of someone choosing whether to say the next thing, that she had heard afterward who he was, and hoped she had made a decent impression. He told her she had made the only impression that mattered, which was treating a stranger at a front desk, as though his presence there was a normal and legitimate thing. He walked through the lobby past the place where the briefcase had fallen, past the staircase where Sebastian had descended, past the stretch of floor that had absorbed a sound like a book dropped on marble, and out through the main entrance. The same set of double doors he had come through on a rainy Tuesday, carrying nothing that announced itself. Somewhere in the hotel's service standards documentation, filed between a section on complaint escalation protocol and a section on accessibility accommodation, was a single sentence that had been added during the policy revision and had remained through all subsequent edits. A hotel earns its reputation not by how it treats the guests who could destroy it, but by how it treats the ones who cannot. 6 months before, Nolan Pierce had walked in through that same front door and been treated like someone who did not belong there. Now he owned the building. But the thing worth noting was not the name on the deed. It was that the door opened the same way for everyone now, which was the only way a door should open, and which had cost him considerably more than the 61%.